Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Paul took a deep breath as he drove down the quiet road cutting through the hills around Hillsborough. The September sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple, but he barely noticed the scenery. His mind was elsewhere, stuck on a conversation that had happened just 3 hours earlier at the dinner table in the home he and Brielle had built together over more than 2 decades. Words still echoed in his ears like shards of glass. I need to feel something new. I need to reconnect with who I really am. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to make sense of the absurdity of it all. 21 years. 21 years of marriage, partnership, and shared life. And now Brielle was simply announcing she wasn't in love anymore, as casually as commenting on the weather. Paul Hendricks wasn't a dramatic man. At 47, he'd built a solid reputation in Hillsborough as the veterinarian who treated every animal with the same dedication he gave to his own life. He was methodical, patient, observant, qualities that made him excellent at his job but also meant he noticed things. Details. Subtle changes. And in recent weeks, he'd noticed changes in Brielle. The way she'd look away when he entered a room. Her short, almost automatic replies when he asked about her day. The phone that now always sat face down, its screen guarded as if it held secrets. He'd tried to ignore it, attributing everything to her stress from yoga classes and her work as an influencer. But that conversation, that abrupt declaration, confirmed what he'd feared. When he got home that Friday night after driving aimlessly for nearly an hour, Paul found the house silent. Brielle was in the guest bedroom, the door closed. She'd said she needed space. Space. The word felt like a cruel euphemism for something far bigger. He went to the kitchen, made tea he didn't drink, sat at the table, and stayed there motionless, trying to figure out exactly when everything had started falling apart. That's when he saw her laptop, open on the counter. Brielle had always been careless with technology, overly confident in the privacy of their home. Paul glanced down the hallway at the closed guest room door, and something inside him snapped. It wasn't the usual Paul who got up and walked over to the laptop. It was a man who'd just realized 21 years might mean nothing at all. The screen was unlocked. The browser was open to an email tab. Paul hesitated for a second, his conscience screaming that this was an invasion of privacy. But then he remembered Brielle's distant gaze, the coldness with which she'd announced the end of her love, and he clicked into the inbox. He didn't have to look far. The messages were right there, neatly organized in a folder labeled only K. Paul opened the first one. It was from 2 weeks ago. Words he never imagined reading, written by the woman who'd promised to love him until death parted them. You make me feel alive again, Kellen. When I'm with you, I forget all my responsibilities, all the masks I wear. I'm just me. Free. Paul's stomach turned. He kept reading, each message cutting deeper than the last. Kellen. The name sounded familiar. Kellen Roth, the climbing instructor who'd taught classes at the community center. Brielle had started attending those classes 3 months earlier, saying she wanted to try something new, to challenge her body. Paul had supported the idea, happy to see her excited. Now he understood the kind of challenge she'd been seeking. The messages grew more explicit as he scrolled through them. Conversations about secret meetings. Photos that should never have been taken. Plans for when I finally leave him. Paul read every word, each one searing into his mind like fire on flesh. By the time he finished, it was almost 3 in the morning. He hooked up an old printer they kept in the office, printed every email, every photo, every piece of evidence. He saved everything onto a flash drive and hid it in the locked drawer of his private clinic office. Then he erased the print history, closed the laptop exactly as he'd found it, and went to the living room couch. He couldn't sleep. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, planning his next steps with the same precision he used when treating injured animals. Only this time, he was the one who was wounded. And he needed to protect himself. On Saturday morning, Paul woke early and made coffee as he always did. When Brielle came downstairs around 8, he was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. She seemed surprised to see him so composed. "Good morning," she said cautiously. Paul looked up and offered a faint smile. "Morning. Sleep well?" Brielle nodded, still wary, and poured herself some coffee. They sat in silence for a few minutes until Paul spoke, his tone casual. "Brielle, I need you to sign some clinic documents today. Nothing major, just contract updates." She looked at him, clearly relieved he hadn't brought up last night's conversation. "Sure, no problem." Paul got up, went to the office, and returned with a brown folder. He placed it on the table in front of her. "It's all in here." Brielle opened the folder carelessly, expecting veterinary forms. Instead, she saw the first printed page, her own email to Kellen from 2 weeks earlier. Her words, laid bare in black and white. Color drained from her face instantly. She flipped the page. Another email. She flipped again. Photos. She slammed the folder shut as if burned, looked up at Paul, her voice trembling. "Paul, I can explain." He raised a hand, cutting her off. "You don't need to. You explained everything last night. Want to feel something new? Fine. You'll get to feel the cold reality of a divorce, and of splitting everything we built. Including the clinic." Brielle tried to speak, tears starting to fall, but Paul was unmoved. "Don't try to manipulate me with tears, Brielle. You had 3 months to think about the consequences. Now you'll face them." He took the folder back, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of the kitchen. Brielle stayed seated, alone, her coffee cooling in the cup. Paul didn't waste any time. That same Saturday, at 10 in the morning, he was in the office of Ted Carlson, a lawyer he'd known since college. Ted listened silently, flipped through the evidence Paul had brought, and nodded slowly. "You've got everything you need. Oregon is a no-fault divorce state, so infidelity won't weigh as heavily on asset division as it would elsewhere, but we still have room to negotiate. Is the clinic in both your names?" Paul confirmed it was. "Yes. But I founded it, I run it, I built its reputation." She only became a partner much later, more for marital formality than actual involvement. Ted gave a slight smile. "Then we'll fight for every cent. And more, Paul, Hillsboro's a small town. If you want, we can make this public. Reputation matters here." Paul thought for a moment, weighing his options. Part of him wanted discretion, just to end it and move on. But another part, the wounded and betrayed part, wanted Brielle to feel the weight of her choices. "Make it public," he said firmly. Ted nodded. "I'll get everything ready. She'll be served on Monday." The weekend was tense. Brielle tried talking to Paul several times, but he kept a polite distance, responding only when necessary. She even mentioned Kellen, saying she'd end it, that it had been a mistake, that she still loved Paul. He listened silently, then replied, "Brielle, you don't cheat on someone for 3 months by accident. You made choices. I'm making mine too." On Sunday night, she slept in the guest room again, and Paul finally managed to close his eyes, knowing everything would change on Monday. Monday morning, Brielle had a yoga class scheduled for 10 at the studio she rented in downtown Hillsboro. Paul knew that. Ted knew it too. The process server arrived at the studio at 10:15, just as Brielle was mid-sequence, 10 students around her, all focused on breath and movement. The door opened, and a man in a suit walked in holding an envelope. "Brielle Hendricks?" She turned her head, confused, interrupting the class. "Yes?" The officer approached her and handed her the envelope. "Divorce summons. You've been served." The silence that followed was deafening. The students exchanged glances. Brielle took the envelope with trembling hands, opened it right there, and read the first few lines. Her name. Paul's name. The word divorce in bold letters. Evidence of infidelity attached. Her legs nearly gave out. The officer left. Brielle stood in the middle of the studio, clutching the papers, as her students began whispering. One of them, Patricia, who'd known Brielle for years, asked softly, "Are you okay, Brielle?" She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, mumbled something about canceling class, and ran out, leaving 10 confused women behind. But the news didn't take long to spread. Hillsborough had only 15,000 residents. By that afternoon, half the town already knew Brielle Hendricks was getting divorced, and the other half was speculating about why. When someone mentioned Paul had proof of her affair, speculation turned to certainty. Brielle's social media accounts, once followed by nearly 20,000 people interested in wellness and spirituality, started filling with messages. Some supportive, but most expressing disappointment and judgment. "You always seemed so zen, but I guess it was all just a front. Poor Paul. He deserved so much better." Brielle tried to control the narrative, posting a vague message about getting through tough times and forgiving yourself, but the damage was done. When Kellen Roth heard his name was tied to the divorce proceedings, he panicked. He was married and had 2 young kids. He couldn't afford to be publicly exposed as an adulterer. On Tuesday morning, he called Brielle. The conversation was short and brutal. "Brielle, I can't talk to you anymore. This is out of control. My wife is furious. I need to protect my family." She tried arguing, saying Paul was overreacting, that they could resolve everything discreetly. Kellen wouldn't listen. It was a mistake from the start. Good luck with everything. And he hung up. Brielle tried calling back, sent messages, but he blocked her number. She was alone. In the months that followed, the divorce moved forward with surgical precision. Ted Carlson built a solid case, showing that Paul had founded the clinic years before the marriage, that Brielle's inclusion as a partner had been more symbolic than functional, and that her infidelity represented a serious breach of trust. Brielle's lawyer, a competent woman named Linda Marsh, tried to negotiate, but she knew she was fighting a losing battle. The evidence was irrefutable: the emails, the photos, witness statements from people who'd seen Brielle and Kellen together in compromising situations. Linda advised Brielle to accept a settlement. "You could drag this out, but you'll just spend more money and end up worse off. Paul has the whole community behind him. You don't." Brielle, devastated, agreed. The final settlement gave Paul 70% of the veterinary clinic. Brielle received 30% in cash, the market value of her share, but had no further administrative or decision-making role. The house was sold, and the profits split evenly. Brielle used the money to move to Portland, 90 minutes away, where no one knew her. She tried to start over, opening a small yoga studio in a less affluent neighborhood, but the clientele was different. There were no more brand deals, no more event invitations, no more aura of a respected wellness influencer. She was just another yoga instructor in a city full of them. Paul, on the other hand, stayed steady. The clinic remained successful, and he hired a new veterinarian, Simone Torres, a skilled, discreet professional who brought fresh energy without any personal drama. Paul threw himself into his work, devoted himself to the animals he'd always loved, and found comfort in the routine he'd once considered dull. He started going out more, accepted invitations from friends, and reconnected with old hobbies. Slowly, the pain gave way to relief. He realized he was better off alone than trapped with someone who didn't value him. A year and a half after the divorce, on a rainy April afternoon, Paul went to Portland for a veterinary conference. During a break, he decided to visit an organic food fair near his hotel. He'd always liked that kind of atmosphere, the positive energy, the fresh produce. He was examining heirloom tomatoes at a stall when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Paul?" He turned and saw Brielle. She looked different, thinner, shorter hair, less confident posture. She wore simple clothes, nothing like her former sophistication. Paul felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Pity? Satisfaction? Maybe a little of both. Brielle. Hey. She gave a small, uncertain smile. What a coincidence. Are you living here now? Paul shook his head. No. Just here for a conference. And you? I live here now. I have a yoga studio in the Buckman district. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the fair filling the space between them. Brielle took a deep breath, clearly gathering courage. Paul, I know I have no right to ask this, but, are you okay? He nodded. I am. The clinic's doing really well. I hired a new vet, we're expanding services. She forced a smile. That's great. I'm happy for you. Another silence. Then Brielle spoke, her voice trembling. I think about what I did a lot. About what I lost. I was so confused, Paul. I thought I needed that it was the only way to feel alive again. But I was wrong. Completely wrong. Paul looked at her, really looked, and saw sincerity in her face. But he also saw the woman who'd chosen to betray 21 years for a 3-month affair. And he felt that although the hurt had lessened, it was still there. Brielle, I believe you regret it. But regret doesn't change what happened. You made choices. And I made mine. I chose to protect myself. I chose to move on. She blinked quickly, trying to hold back tears. I know. I just wanted you to know I'm truly sorry. Paul nodded. I know. And maybe someday I'll be able to forgive you completely. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it definitely doesn't mean going back. Brielle swallowed hard, accepting his words. Is there any chance we could be friends? Someday? Paul thought for a moment. Maybe. With time. A lot of time. She nodded, resigned. I understand. Paul picked up the tomatoes he'd chosen, paid the vendor, and turned to Brielle one last time. Take care of yourself, Brielle. Really? You too, Paul. He walked through the stalls, leaving her there, and as he moved away, he felt something strange. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was peace, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized he'd truly moved on. And that was okay. 3 months later, Paul met someone. He wasn't looking, wasn't expecting it, but it happened. Laura Simmons, a marine biologist visiting Hillsborough for a river conservation project. They met at a cafe and talked for hours about animals, about life, about second chances. Laura was also divorced and understood the scars that left. There was no rush, no pressure, just genuine connection. They started seeing each other more, and Paul discovered it was possible to feel something new without destroying the past. It was possible to rebuild without bitterness. Meanwhile, Brielle stayed in Portland. Her yoga studio survived but didn't thrive. She'd lost the confidence she once had, the certainty that she was special. Brands that used to sponsor her now worked with other influencers. The followers who'd left didn't come back. She taught small classes, earned just enough to pay the bills, but life no longer had its former sparkle. Kellen never spoke to her again. His wife had found out everything, and though they hadn't divorced, their marriage was never the same. He avoided any mention of Brielle's name, as if she were a ghost from a past he preferred to forget. And maybe that's exactly what she was. On a cold November night, Brielle was alone in the studio, folding yoga mats after a particularly empty class. Only 4 students had shown up. She looked around the modest space, so different from the life she'd had in Hillsborough, and finally let herself feel the full weight of her choices. She cried there, in the silence of the studio, not so much for losing Paul, but for what she herself had destroyed. The trust she'd betrayed. The community she'd abandoned. The version of herself she could never get back. She realized, far too late, that feeling something new didn't mean the new thing was better. Sometimes, it just meant losing what you already had. That same night, Paul was at home with Laura, watching a documentary about sea lions. They laughed at a funny scene, sharing popcorn. It was simple, calm, real. And for the first time in years, Paul didn't miss anything. He looked at Laura, who was smiling at the TV, and thought about how strangely life reorganizes itself. How sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. He didn't wish Brielle any harm. But he also didn't feel anything for her anymore. And that indifference, he realized, was true freedom. The lesson was clear to everyone who knew the story. Some choices come at a cost. And that cost is sometimes paid in loneliness, regret, and the cold exposure of a divorce that reveals not just paperwork, but the truth of who we really are. Brielle had wanted to feel something new. And she did. The difference between illusion and reality, between fleeting passion and true partnership, between having everything and ending up with almost nothing. Paul, too, had felt something new, the strength to protect himself, the courage to move forward, and the peace of knowing he deserved loyalty. In the end, they both learned the same lesson, though in radically different ways. Not every new feeling is worth chasing. Sometimes, what you already have is exactly what you need. And you only realize that when it's too late to get it back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.